our previous video, we presented an overview of the TOEIC reading section. We said that the reading section contains 100 questions and it should take you around 75 minutes to answer. In our first video, we talked about question type 5, which is involving incomplete sentences. In this video, we're going to be looking at question type 6, which is called text completion. Now, in this particular activity, you will notice that there are sets of readings, and each set will contain 3 questions each, basically totaling 12 questions. Now, the design for this section of the test will actually appear to be somewhat similar to that of Part 5, which is what we saw in the previous video. You will have to make a choice between 2 major types of questions and their subcategories. The two major areas that we're looking at are what we call grammar patterns, which usually involves distinguishing among different members of word families or parts of speech, or looking specifically at forms of verbs. The other categories involving word choice, and the many different ways that people can be confused by the choices of words that we use. So again, generally the questions will involve the same part of speech, but different actual words to choose from. And there are multiple categories here where the test will try to confuse you. Now we will be looking at 3 sample questions taken from the TOEIC Examinee Handbook. Once again, the link is provided at the bottom of this video for the packet that you can download. Now first off, let's just look at the question itself, or the sets of questions. It appears like this. So if you'll notice, first off, it does seem to appear differently from question 5 in the sense that there does seem to be a reading format. So what we're going to do here in this first part is just kind of give a general overview of how to actually answer questions on this part. The first thing you will notice is that it's an actual reading, and specifically it's an email. And if you notice, it actually states that here in the introduction to the questions. The next thing you might want to do is to go ahead and skim the whole reading first, just to get an overall idea of the text. Now, in just a moment, we'll talk about what skimming is. But for now, basically the idea is to look over everything quickly, just to get a sense as to what the general idea of this email happens to be. Then, as you actually get into answering questions, if you recall from the previous video, we talked about the difference between the prompt and the answer stem. The answer stem, of course, involves the 4 choices. Well, this is obviously a little bit different in the sense that, apart from question 5, where you had just basically 1 sentence to look at, here you have many sentences. So in this case, we're going to look at the answer stem to guess what type of question it's going to be, but you'll notice that we will need to go back and actually look at the text some more to figure out how to answer the questions. Then you may need to read the sentence itself and the other sentences that are adjoining, which means perhaps for the first question, for example, reading the sentences that come before it. Now, as you move along through the reading, you will notice that you will have to chunk or group more important pieces of information as you go to answer some of the questions later in the reading passage. So this is kind of our general overview of how we're going to answer questions on parts on this question type. Now this brings us, of course, to our first hint. What exactly do we mean by reading, skimming, and chunking? These may be new words to you. Well, again, reading is what most of us think about when we think about moving our eyes over the text. But to distinguish here, we're going to say that reading means to pay very close attention to something. So in this case, we're trying to look at the text to understand it deeply. Sometimes we may need to read a text several times in order to completely understand its meaning. Now, of course, you don't have a lot of time on the TOEIC to read something, but then again, you probably won't have to read it many times. It probably won't be that difficult to understand. Skimming, on the other hand, involves looking over a passage just quickly to establish just maybe the organization or what we call the basic idea or gist. Now, you really should not do this more than 1 or 2 times on the test for each reading. So, in this case, skim it the first time when you first see the text in order to get the basic idea. But really, at this point, then you should jump into the questions. Now, this third word that we're introducing in this video is a process called chunking. Now, you will notice that chunking is a very flexible process, and oftentimes it involves how we look at information and how information works together. Now, we actually discussed this under the topic of collocations or collocations. And basically, collocations are examples of chunked text, but in the sense that they directly work together. So, for example, when an adjective describes a noun, we call that a collocation. That's because these two ideas are working together. So, in a sense, you could take both of the ideas and call this a chunk of language. Now, we'll talk more about chunking as we move along, and you'll see how collocations are also going to play a part. But again, the idea here is chunking is flexible. So, for example, as we read further along in the passage, you may have to chunk more information to look for things that are more connected, because in this case it may depend on more than just two words. Sometimes we may have to look at several ideas, such as words, sentences, or perhaps even paragraphs, and that will really depend on what you're trying to do. So, for example, reading the first question, we don't have to chunk a lot of information, but by the time you get to the third question, we may have to chunk a lot. So again, in this process, we skim at the beginning just to get the basic idea. We look at the answer stem in question to see, well, what is the question asking us to do? Is it a grammar question or a word choice question? And then we go back to the text itself and often need to read some information. Now, you'll notice that we read only when it's necessary. We don't necessarily want to read everything at the beginning. That takes a lot of time. But as we read, we may need to find pieces of information, to chunk pieces of information together that will help us in solving each problem. And that's what we're going to do in this video, is show how to do that. Now, of course, this brings us to discussing question type 6. Is it really that different from question type 5? You probably noticed that there are a lot of things that are similar. For example, the idea of the grammar choice versus grammar questions versus word choice questions. Those seem to be very similar. And in fact, what you're seeing here on the test, and this is something a little bit different from other tests in the sense that they want to provide some sort of context so that the test itself makes it look more authentic. So in this case, this is part of the Educational Testing Service's desire to present information in a more integrated way. So instead of just looking at a single sentence and trying to find the grammar or vocabulary idea, now ETS wants to see if you can put all of this information together. So using these more authentic looking materials, that is part of the idea of trying to understand how things work in context. So in this case, the answer is yes, there is some difference between the two. Chunking is a big difference here, because since we have more text that we have to look at, we're going to have to pay more attention as we move along. So yes, you can skim the text just to give a basic idea, but you're really going to need to pay more attention as you continue along in the questions. So in this case, you will need to chunk more and more information to answer questions as you go along. But again, only read text when it's necessary. So in this case, trying to read everything probably would take too much time. But if you see a particular question in which you can answer it fairly easily, then don't necessarily worry about having to go back and read everything again. So my general recommendation here is read only when it's necessary, but don't try to read everything at the beginning. So as you can see, there is a little bit of difference, of course, between the two question type 6 and 5. There are some slightly different strategies we're going to look at in this video. Okay, now let's go in and answer the questions. Now remember our general testing strategy as we discussed in the first video. As we look at the answer stem, we're going to try to decide what type and what subcategory the questions belong to. But we're now going to chunk more information in the prompt to help us solve the answer. In question type 5, it didn't really take that much information to help us. Then we're going to have to read text if we need to find the answer. Of course, we're only going to read if it's necessary, which in this case, some parts of it will be necessary. And then we're going to use the process of elimination to help find the answer. And again, the process of elimination is something we talked about in the previous video. Okay, well let's take a look now at the questions, and the first thing we're going to do is try to go through and identify what type of questions we have and which subcategory. So now let's look at it a little more carefully. Looking at question 141, look at the choices you have here. And I'm just going to scroll through these kind of in a little bit quick way. We're not going to actually answer them yet, but take a look at what we're asked to do. 142, look at our choices here. And then notice in 143, the choices look very similar to each other in meaning, but slightly different in form. Okay, so now that we've looked at the questions very quickly, now let's see if we can review what type questions we have and the subcategories. So for 141, we have a word choice question. Again, notice all the words are the same part of speech, but are different words in meaning. So in this case, it's a word choice question, and the best category they belong to are the general business subcategory. 142, again, we have words that kind of provide a transitional nature, but are different, again, in meaning. So we have a word choice question that belongs to the transition subcategory. And finally, 143, as I mentioned as we looked at it the first time, these appear to be words that had the same basic meaning, but different parts of speech. So in this case, that would be a grammar question. And specifically the verb form. Since they all appear to be in verb form, we're trying to figure out how to use them. Now, this kind of brings us to a trick that we perhaps noticed in the first video, but definitely going to take some time to talk about now. If you notice, many of the questions on the test so far have not necessarily been grammar related. They've been more related to word choice. And there's a reason for that. Part of it is because there are more opportunities to trick you with the word choice question. Now, why is that? Well, because you actually have to know the meaning of these words. So the process of elimination does become more difficult to apply if you don't know the meanings. So, for example, if you see 4 choices you need to eliminate, but you know the meaning only of 1 or 2 of those words, it's going to be difficult to eliminate the other choices if you don't know what they mean. So don't be surprised if you will see more of these types of questions on the test. Now, in general, if we think about it, where are the common areas where students can get confused with word choice? Well, we're not going to go through all of the particular areas of confusion here in the video in terms of how to identify them, but we're just going to talk about them in very general ways. For example, adjectives can be very confusing. One reason is because oftentimes students get the forms of adjectives confused, but also in comparison with adverbs. Adjectives also can be confusing because oftentimes they look like comparatives or superlatives. Phrasal verbs, of course, can also be confusing because certain phrasal verbs go together with certain prepositions. Connectors are especially confusing because they're generally those coordinate connectors in which we connect equal things, and subordinate connectors, which generally do not connect equal things, such as conditional connectors. Transition words. Again, transitions work on different levels as well. And, of course, the general business vocabulary. Again, these are easy to confuse because oftentimes we need to know how the words fit into the blank. So those collocative ideas that we're going to look at again here, that can be very confusing. Now let's go back and see if we can answer the questions. Now, looking at question 141, the first thing we notice is that many of the words do appear to be similar in meaning. For example, involved and joined and included all definitely seem to be very much related in terms of basic meaning. But the question is, how do they collocate or chunk with the information with the words before or after? Now, of course, now we realize that that's only part of the situation. We really do need to kind of go back for a moment and to investigate what this particular email is talking about. So I'm going to pull up my pen for a moment here, and as we go through the reading, let's try to see if we can identify what are some important pieces of information that might help us in beginning to answer these questions. Well, as we skim through the first time, we see that this particular email is about a performance bonus, and it is addressed to employees of a particular company. So this is something to keep in mind. Now, first off, what is a bonus? This is something that we probably need to know. Well, a bonus is usually something we get extra, usually for good work. So even before we continue to move on, skimming through the information, we want to see, well, did we get the bonus or not? Well, as I'm skimming through the first time, it says that there was a great success for us. So we want to be rewarded for excellent performance, and we've been approved a bonus for everyone. So as I'm skimming through, notice what I'm doing is picking up some important words here to start thinking about how to read. Now, we'll talk a lot more about some of these predictive skills in the next video when we talk about the reading comprehension section. But again, notice how I'm picking up some words already that kind of show me the general idea of what we're reading. Now, specifically, when I look at the particular sentence, now I need to figure out how do these words fit in the blank. Well, again, the first thing is a bonus. The bonus will be something in my next paycheck. So the bonus itself will be something. And N is the next word to collocate, the paycheck. So what I want us to think about for a moment is looking at this one sentence. You see, I just skimmed the sentences before it, but now I really need to pay attention to this sentence. Which words do seem to fit into this example? Well, let's start with our process of elimination. Which ones make no sense at all? Well, first off, we can easily eliminate C, I think, because bonuses aren't composed. Composed, for example, might be talking about music or composing a letter, but generally we don't compose bonuses. All right, now let's look at the other three choices. Now, another thing to think about is even though all of these words appear to be the same part of speech, the question is how are they used in the sentence? Well, look at the word that actually comes before the blank. It's to be plus this participle. Well, in this case, we do see that we're using a verb idea, but in what way? Well, in this case, it appears to be that we're using a verb in the passive voice. So what we're looking at first is which particular verbs make sense to be used in the passive voice in this context. Well, if a bonus will be involved in my next paycheck, to be involved in something sounds like somebody's actually doing something. Well, generally with passive voice questions, we ask ourselves, can people actually do something with this? Who is actually doing the activity? Is the bonus doing something, or is somebody doing something to the bonus? Well, in this case, we don't involve a bonus. We, as people, get involved in activities. So I think we can also eliminate A as a choice here. Now, as we continue to move along, we've got two choices left, joined and included. Now, again, when people join something, we think about, for example, joining a health club, joining a team. This would also seem to be a verb that makes a lot more sense in the active voice. So in this case, I don't think that would work in this situation either. Well, now let's look at our last choice, included. A bonus will be included in our next paycheck. Can somebody include a bonus in a paycheck? That seems to be true. So in this case, our answer is D. And this is because we often think about the word included being used in the passive voice. Okay, so as we progress, notice how we may need to look at more information before the next question. So in this case, this is something we may need to understand as we move along. How much information do we need? Well, as I look at number 142, remember that this was a transition question. So our first question is, well, what is the transition between the information up here, which generally seems to be fairly good information? We have success. Things have gone pretty well. We've got a bonus in the next paycheck. So how exactly will this connect? So that's kind of our first thing to think about. How much information do we need to chunk in order to see how it connects? Well, since this is a transition question, so we'll come back to our pen now. And as we look at our four choices. Instead, in addition, beforehand, or otherwise. Now, let's take a moment as we look at the answer stem to basically understand the meanings here. Well, for example, if something is instead of something else, this is basically giving us a different choice. So we'll kind of say right now that this is something that we're looking at that would be different from the information before it. In addition, on the other hand, would be information that we would add, so that the information before it would be similar in tone to the information that comes after it. As I look at C, beforehand, the basic meaning, of course, is it's something we do before something else. So again, beforehand is similar to before we do this. Okay. And then finally, when we think about otherwise, this is something that we would do that would be, again, perhaps slightly different from the information that comes before it. So we may have to do this, and talking about when we look at the difference between A and D, obviously these are not the same words. The TOEIC would never include two choices that are exactly the same. But we probably need to look at the text in order to better understand how these two words would be different. Okay, so now we look at the actual information. So first, let's read the sentence. So blank, we are now calculating wage increases for the upcoming year. So how would this connect to the information before it? Well, we said the bonus will be included in the next paycheck. So in this case, are we talking about information that would be different, the same, or are we indicating some kind of sequence? Well, I think as we can see, we're trying to say that bonuses are going to be included. And they're trying to figure out how to increase our wage for the upcoming year. Now, what's interesting, though, is we may need to keep reading. Because even though the sentence itself tells us that these wage increases are occurring, how does it actually connect to maybe some information that follows? Remember, this is a transition between one piece of information and the next piece of information. So just for a moment, let's look at the following text. So each employee's performance will be examined carefully as we determine the appropriate increase. So are we thinking, as we move back for a moment, are we thinking that the information here is going to be different from the information that follows? Well, as we noticed, it seems as if they're talking about more about how this particular bonus is going to be determined. So in this case, we can eliminate A and most likely eliminate D. Since these are both indicating differences or different directions, or something that might happen in spite of something else, these two don't seem to make sense. Now, as I go back, I also notice that paycheck, my next paycheck, is this particular bonus going to be for all of next year? Well, let's go back to the idea of a bonus. A bonus is something extra that we receive, but generally a bonus is something we receive one time. Here, we are talking about actually increasing our wages for the whole upcoming year. So the question is, do we consider that this is information that would happen before the bonus is going to be determined? Or is this information that's going to be extra in addition to the bonus? Well, again, generally when we do well, things improve. So in this case, the bonus is going to be included, and then as I read along a little bit more, each employee's performance will be examined as we determine the appropriate increase. All full-time employees are eligible for this increase. So in this case, it seems like that we're not talking about that this step will be before something else. In fact, if I notice the language here is involving the future. So in this case, I think our answer is going to be B, in addition to this information. So again, as we return, we notice that we were successful. We received a bonus, and then next we're probably also going to get increased wages for the next year. So our answer in this case would be B, in addition to this information. Now, transition words can often be very confusing, but I wanted you to notice how I had to read before and now even look a little bit further ahead in order to understand how these transitions work. That's because transitions connect information that comes before it with the information that comes after it. Okay, now that we're back now to question 143. As we said before, we have to figure out how much information we need to chunk. Well, we have to be able to understand the information that came before it and, of course, the information that comes after it. Now, fortunately, there's only just a little bit more information at the end. It does say, thank you again for making last year a success. So in a way, this email appears to be doing two things. It's telling us what a good job we did last year and what benefits we're going to have for the next year. Now, as we look at this information, we recognize that it is a grammar question. All of the words basically seem to be the same meaning, but different forms. So, again, how much information do we need to chunk in order to figure out the answer? Well, since I don't have to think about the meaning of the word, I probably should think about, well, how would I make a choice as to which verb form to use? Well, as I go back through the paragraph, I notice now that we're focusing on this information here. So the question is, how much more do I need to go back in order to answer it? Well, since I don't need the meaning of the word necessarily, I may not necessarily feel like I need to go back and reread any of this information back before question 142. So now we'll just kind of stick to some of the information here. Well, if I notice with verb forms, one thing I have to pay attention to are the different tenses that we see. For example, I see will. I see the first week of January. It's probably not January now if we're receiving a bonus or going to receive a bonus for the previous year. January is probably coming up soon. So the question is, are we going to be using something similar to the future? Because in this case, we don't know necessarily if the past is going to be necessary. So I think at this point we can eliminate A because the past is not what we're talking about. All right, now look at our other three choices. We probably could also eliminate D because also the D is the past tense but a different form. In A, we have what we would call the simple past. In D, we have basically what we would call the progressive, the past progressive. Both forms do not seem appropriate since both are in the past tense. So now we have B and C. And remember, part of our strategy is to decide between the two. Well, if we look at B, B is an infinitive form of the verb. So again, notice how I'm going through each answer choice and trying to decide the different ideas here. I can only eliminate answers, or I can eliminate only answers that I understand. So hopefully we do know what all of these different ideas are. Well, generally infinitives are ideas that we use after verbs. So as I go back up to the sentence here, I notice there is no verb here before the blank. In this case, it appears that B also does not work. Well, let's try C in the blank and see if we think it works. Your supervisor will inform you of the amount of your increase during the first week of January. So as I go back for a moment, I see that our performance will be examined. We are eligible for this increase, but we will be informed of this at some point in the future. So in this case, it appears that C is going to be the correct answer. So remember, a lot of the strategy we use for question part 5, we are going to use in answering the questions on part 6. However, one of the big differences is we are actually going to have to pay more attention to the text around it. So even though a lot of the strategies of process of elimination are similar, you'll notice we're going to need more information to make these choices. And a lot of it will depend on the type of question. So again, if it's a transition question, we should think about how information connects from one idea to the next. If it's a grammar question, we probably should look around and see, well, what is the particular tense if it's a verb question, for example. So, our final thoughts. We said that type 6, the question here, appears to be very similar, but there are some key differences. First off, the questions are organized into a specific reading format, whether it's an email, a letter, news release, or so on. The type of question and the subcategories are the same. So these are the same things that you saw in question type 5. But as you move along, you notice that oftentimes we need to pay more attention. We have to chunk more information as we read to solve the later questions. Skimming the whole text at the beginning is probably helpful, but only read when it's necessary. So as you saw in our example, we skimmed through the whole text just to get the basic idea. But then we started reading when the question required it. So for example, in question 142, we had to read some of the information before and after it, because at that point it was necessary to answer the question. Once again, several recommended materials to help you improve your knowledge for this test. Again, the official TOEIC website includes lots of helpful free information, which is where our question came from today. The Tactics for TOEIC textbook series, again by Grant True, excellent resource for helping you prepare for the listening and reading test and the speaking and writing. And then, of course, our new TOEFL and TOEIC preparation website, the link of which you can find at the bottom of this video.